All right, good morning, everyone. Glad to see everyone back again this morning to continue our study of the book of Esther. Hopefully, everyone made it through the storms last night safe and sound. It is definitely good to be back after a small absence last week. Thank Josh Yancey for filling in for me. My wife Olivia and our new son Oliver are at home resting. They'll hopefully be joining us soon next week, but they're at home and doing well. So if you're hoping to see them today or well wishes, please shoot him a text, give him a call, let him know you're thinking about her. I'm sure she'll greatly appreciate it. She's home with her mom Denise to help her get through this morning. This morning we're continuing through the book of Esther. We are going to get into chapter 4 this week, and I think we'll start off with just kind of refreshing our memories on where we've been the past couple weeks to where we are now. So we started out in the beginning of the book of Esther with the great feast that King Xerxes was putting on to kind of show off his wealth and his riches to all of his princes of the land and all of his big high officials. And that's when he summoned Queen Vashti to show off her beauty. She refused, and that led us into essentially finding a new queen because the princes did not think that she should stay as queen with refusing an order from the king. That way, none of the men they're running their households, their wives wouldn't disobey them and kind of do as they please. So in order to prevent that from spreading and happening, they outed Vashti and started the hunt for a new queen. A decree got sent out, and young women were gathered from across the lands of the vast empire, whether from Ethiopia to India, to gather these women up for the king. And we went through the process of them being prepared through sorry, my brain is going to be a little scattered from the lack of sleep over the past week, but these 6 months of perfumes and oils, and the other 6 months after that, the preparations until they finally had a chance to be noted by the king to eventually be selected to be queen, where we see Esther enter the scene where she gets selected, and now she has become the new queen. And now we've also had back in chapter 3, Haman got introduced, where Mordecai didn't want to bow in front of him, as Jewish culture at the time noted didn't want to bow to him, especially being an Agagite. So Haman, with his own personal motives, wanted to institute a pogrom against the Jews and wipe them out, where he got the favor of the king and sent out a decree to exterminate the Jews in the 12th month, which leads us up to now in chapter 4. So we will start out, if someone would like to read, let's go with chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, if someone could.
When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate, clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes.
Thank you. As we see here now that Mordecai is entering into a mourning stage, his decree has went out. As we saw at the very end of chapter 3, it was the citadel of Susa was essentially let left kind of like perplexed. As we see in verse 15, it says, "The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Susa, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was perplexed." Because remember, this decree kind of came out suddenly. No one knows exactly why this happened, which we'll get into a little bit about Mordecai saying like what happened to him and how this all came about. But because Mordecai didn't bow, this decree came out. So now all the citizens are wondering why are the Jews being pretty much marked for extinction or extermination for what they seem at the time is absolutely no reason. It's the same thing as we talked about 2 weeks ago now. If something came out today where it was like, hey, this group of people needs to be wiped out, we'd all be like, why? That doesn't really seem exactly correct. So Mordecai, when all that happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud, bitter cry. I'm going to flip over to Psalms chapter 30, verse 5, which is one of the ones I didn't mark, but there's a good passage there that outlines about kind of why he's doing that. There you go. Psalm 30, verse 5. "For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." So he's out. It was noted in kind of another concurrence that with him weeping for the night, that they're out in mourning, and joy comes in the morning, because we're going to see as this progresses through, Esther will go to the king and eventually get all this overturned. So he's out weeping through to show his sorrow, the fact that this is going to happen. And it seems in our culture today, you won't really see a whole lot of people going out if they're in mourning, if a loved one is lost. They're not on the street corners and their sackcloths crying out and weeping. Most of the time our mourning is done in private or at home in our own culture, but back then it was very common for everyone to be out publicly mourning. And he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. So the sackcloth was essentially like a goat's hair clothing. It was not comfortable. Neither was putting the ashes in the hair. It was all very itchy. It was meant to be not comfortable because you were in mourning. You were not trying to be in your fancy clothes, drinking your coffee and your teas in the morning. You were out in the city. You were uncomfortable. You were crying to essentially go through more agony. As far as the king, or his front gate, the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. It was a rule back in the day that you cannot enter the king's gate when you were dressed like that. You had to be in proper attire, which we'll see in a little bit. Esther will send clothing for Mordecai to be clothed in more proper attire to go inside the king's gate. But it was essentially to keep mourning and despair away from the king, because the king had more important matters to attend to. He couldn't be distracted by people being in mourning or in this kind of state of mind. And then every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was a great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in their sackcloth and ashes. I do want to read a passage out of the companion study book here, because I think it outlines a lot of this very well. It says, "In the midst of their great tragedy, the Jews were to learn that they were not helpless. In the palace of the king, they had an advocate in the person of Esther, though perhaps Mordecai's people did not know in the early stages that the queen was a Jew. But in addition to Esther, the friend of the Jews, their countryman Mordecai had become an important official sitting inside the king's gate. Above all, they were chosen by God. He was their protector. His providential care carried through them through threats and dangers of worldly kingdoms and empires in the past. Neither Babylon nor Persia would be able to erase the Jews from the earth if God decided to keep them. From the first word to the last book of Esther, the Jews were learned that God's providence would keep them. Over the centuries, the world would change, but Moabites and the Philistines would be forgotten. From one generation to the next, the world would know that God protects his oppressed ones." So we talked through the past couple of weeks that God hasn't mentioned at all through this book, but his providential care is definitely there, making things happen, putting things into place, especially putting Esther in her position, which we'll start to see that Esther's role goes from being more passive to laying low, not revealing that she's a Jew, into her taking an active role in showing the true guidance that God has with that. Does anyone have any comments or anything so far in the first couple verses? Awesome. If someone would like to read, now let's do verses 4 through 9, please.
So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to it, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king and make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai.
Thank you. So you can see it is now known that Mordecai is just outside the king's gate in mourning, as you see with Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. And then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. So remember that Mordecai is the cousin of Esther and the adoptive father. So it's very, I'm sure, displeasing for her to see that her adoptive father is outside weeping and heavy mourning, and she's got no idea why this is. There's a lot of speculation of why the garments were sent, if it was for Mordecai to be clothed to come in so she can talk to him, or to end his mourning, which is not obviously noted in here. But Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this is. So after the refusal happened, Hathach goes out. Hathach is kind of translated through to being a good one. So he was definitely a good eunuch, or a good eunuch essentially, as a trusted person. As we'll see here, as he's going back and forth throughout the chapter 4 here, relaying these messages between Esther and Mordecai. And to learn why this is, he went out to Mordecai in the city square in the front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him that all that happened to him and a sum of money that Haman had promised to pay in the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. Does anyone remember how much money that Haman had promised to pay to put into the treasury?
$10,000 of silver.
Yes, sir. A very large sum of money out of his own personal coffers going to the kings to pay for this extermination of the Jews, which, it ties us back into before how this was a very personal thing for him, being an Agagite, trying to eliminate the Jews for what happened years ago, all because Mordecai did not bow to him. It was a very large amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to make this happen. And when it says that Mordecai told him all that happened to him, he's not necessarily being selfish and saying, like, oh, this all happened to me, I'm very sad. It's no, this is what happened. It's the whole story from the point where Mordecai is working inside the king's gate, because he's a very high, trusted, important official, that Haman's coming through. He's not bowing. The other people in the area kind of ratted him out and turned him into Haman, being like, hey, this guy's not bowing. What are you going to do about it? To him promising to pay money to the king's coffers to have this decree go out to exterminate the Jews in the 12th month. Instead, he also gave him a copy of the written decree for his destruction, which was given at Susa, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and then he might command her to go to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So he had a copy of that written decree. So remember, he's working inside the gate, so he actually has access to it to get this decree, or someone was able to get him this decree as it was sent out. And Esther wouldn't necessarily know this is going on or have that decree, because remember, she's a part of the king's harem. Even though she is queen, she is still very much in a sheltered, you want to call it protected, but in a prison-like state, where she's no different than the rest of the concubines in there. She just has a little more attendance, a little more status than the rest of the girls in the harem. So they're not necessarily knowing what's going on in the outside world, because she is not allowed to leave outside of the palace grounds, essentially. So as this plea, let me back up just a pinch here. You might command her to go to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So we see that Mordecai is essentially passing on to Hathach to command her to go to the king. It was not given her an order as if he's the king. It was more coming as a father, like, I need you to go to the king. Like, you need to do this to plead to the king to stop this, because the only person that essentially can do it in this position. And we can see that kind of respectful nature as she eventually, we'll get in a little bit here, she definitely does go, but a command is given back from her to Mordecai, and he does follow that as well. So there's definitely that mutual respect of being both the queen and a father of the queen there. We see that. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Another small excerpt I want to read out of here, because once again, it does outline this pretty well. Then we're actually going to flip over to the book of Daniel in just a minute. But Esther told Mordecai and all the Jews of the empire what they knew to be true. It would be at the risk of her life should Esther make an unscheduled appearance in the presence of the king. As Xerxes the king had brought an end to Vashti's being queen, he could do the same to Esther. Although the Bible is alone in the historical record when it states that any law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed, the Bible dwells in the feature of the Medo-Persian law several times, which is noted in Esther chapter 1, verse 19, Daniel chapter 6, verses 8, 12, and 15. And Esther was able to change the king's mind, as we'll see in a little bit as that progresses through. So we flip over to the book of Daniel, go to chapter 6. I'll give everyone just a second to get there. All right, so Daniel chapter 6, verse 8. So now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, and according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. As you can see, that the law has been established, and they don't want anything changing. It says, also in verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the written decree. So if we all remember, King Darius also is all in the same timeline, the same time era of King Xerxes, being my tired brain, if I remember correctly, King Darius was the father of Xerxes. And then down in verse 12 and 15, so verse 12 notes, and they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And then again, 15, then these men approached the king and said to the king, King, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So we're kind of outlined before Xerxes' time that this is the law that's been laid out. It can't be changed. If you go before the king and not be summoned, you can be put to death if the king did not want you to be there or extend out his scepter. Does anyone have any comments, questions, anything so far in these couple of verses? For all of it, I guess, in general. Awesome. We'll flip over, and if someone wants to read verses 10 through 12 for me.
Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and told him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai.
Excuse me, thank you. You can see here in verse 10 that Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. And that's when we go into verse 11 with noting what Jesse just read off for us. Essentially the law that we see in the book of Daniel. So the law has been played out, and no one can come unless the golden scepter has been reached out, seeking the king, showing favor that they are allowed to be there. And at the very end of it, she said, "Yet I myself have not been called to go to the king these 30 days." So she hasn't been with King Xerxes for, we see, in 30 days here. And at this time, Esther has been queen for 5 years. So it is possible that he might not have shown her as much favor. He's also a bit of interest in her because, remember, he's a man of great wealth and has a very large harem of women, as we've seen through time with different kings displaying their large wealth and harem to show more status. That she hasn't been summoned. She hasn't seen him in quite some time, so she is concerned and worried that, there's a law. If I go there, I haven't been summoned, that I could be put to death. And it hasn't been 30 days, so does King Xerxes even want to see me? I'm most likely going to meet my death, which is a dilemma that we'll get into here in a second that she's going to kind of go through is, will she go to risk it for the king and let the king kill her, or will she let the program get carried through and eventually get killed through that when all the rest of the Jews get exterminated? Or they don't, obviously, but when the decree gets set into place. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. So the command is coming back, and that is coming through to Mordecai. And then let's go ahead and read verses 13 through 14, and then we'll step back into that as well. So someone wants to read 13 and 14 for me.
Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this."
Thank you. So we see that the reply is going back to Esther now that, "Do you not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than the other Jews?" So at this time, as we noted before, that she has been queen for 5 years. She's had contact with Mordecai, and if it hasn't been already publicly known, I'm sure there were suspicions that she was also Jewish, which is probably more relevant now, or more apparent, as there's communication going back and forth with I see her personal eunuch is going between Mordecai and the queen, because he's not going to go anywhere if the queen doesn't command it. So there's definitely that connection there. It says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So he's kind of saying that, like, we have full faith in God that He will deliver us, but do not think that you've been put here for this reason, which she was put here for this reason. Of course, we talk about God's divine providence of putting her in this position amongst all the hundreds of women that were gathered, and putting her in this position. Another passage I want to read out of this book, there's probably no portion of Esther where the providence of God in caring for His people is more apparent than it is in the exchanges between Mordecai and Esther immediately after Haman sent letters to all the governors explaining how the Jews were to be exterminated. The Jews have been in danger of annihilation from people in the past, but God had always delivered them to safety. When in danger, they dressed in sackcloth. Prayer, fasting, and sackcloth went together, as noted in Jeremiah 14:12, Nehemiah 9:1 and 2, and then Ezra 8:21, which we're going to flip over to one of those just a second here. Mordecai believed that just as God had delivered the Jews in the past, so he would deliver them again. The theme of Esther is clear. God watches over his people. It comes as no surprise that the author of Esther kept her faith and the Jewish people's faith in God in the background as Esther and Mordecai converse. Factors that modern readers do not understand were likely involved in the author's choosing not to mention God, but the author's purpose in telling Esther's story is clear enough. Even the bribe offered to the king by Haman would not bring about their ruination. So you can see here there is that blind faith we talked about. There is no apparent intervention of God happening, but Mordecai has the faith that deliverance will come. And he's telling her, it will come through you, and if you don't do anything about it, it will come from somewhere else. As we talked about back in chapters 1 and 2 in the beginning of our lessons, is that there's much a theme of having that faith when there's nothing apparent, nothing is going right for you. There's always keeping that faith in God, because God will come through in the end and deliver. We flip over to Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. I'll read a small section out of there. Give everyone just a second if they want to flip over. Now on the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and with dust on their heads. Then those of Israelite lineage separated themselves from all foreigners, and they stood and confessed their sins and iniquities of their fathers. So it's noted out that prayer, fasting, and sackcloth went together, as we're cross-referencing over in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. That, again, the fasting, sackcloth, and dust in their heads, they were out in the streets. Everyone of Jewish descent and lineage was in mourning in the city, or in the citadel, which in a couple verses here we'll see that coming together more as a command from Esther to Mordecai is to gather all the Jews and be in mourning and be fasting and to go through this period of time, which we'll get here in just a second. Does anyone have? Yes, ma'am.
I think that comment or statement by Mordecai to Esther has a great bearing on what we're going through in our own personal lives. Because so many times when we're facing something that's a real trial, we can think maybe we're in this place at this time for a purpose that would give us courage to do what we need to do instead of being wimpy and hiding under something.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, I've thought of that statement so many times when courage is needed.
Absolutely. And it kind of outlines the importance of prayer and praying, constantly having that open line of communication with God to help definitely carry you through with that. Does anyone have any more comments or points to add on? Sir?
Just thinking about his faith that look, if you don't do anything, something else is going to work out. This is going to be okay. It's not okay right now. And it's not so much that, he's got that faith, but he's also doing things, right? Like he was prepared. Yeah, he's doing his mourning, he's in sackcloth and ashes, but he had the documentation ready to send to her, right? Mm-hmm. He knows he's got that connection with her. He knows that this is an avenue he can pursue, and he's doing that. But think about the preparation. He's torn his clothes, he's in sackcloth and ashes, but yet he's got the documents ready to send to her, right? So he's prepared to do what he can. And so he's not, some people can say that, with my faith, I'm just going to, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to work out. But there's action that needs to happen with it. There's, we need to participate in that solution. And I think that's what we see demonstrated here.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Does anyone else have more comments to add on there? Yes, sir.
The statement in verse 14, I actually saw that in the wild about a month ago. like out in the world, I was taking a class at Verona High School, like on CPR, AED, and all that. And when the teacher walked in, her T-shirt said, "Perhaps you were born for such a time as this." And I'm like,
Ah.
"Whoa, that's from the Bible." But it's kind of neat to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. We will move on then to our next couple of verses. If someone wants to read, actually, hold up that 1 second. I got one small thing to read out of here for verses 13 through 14. Again, kind of going back to the book here. If I can make out my notes that I made a while back. Actually, we covered that already, so we're good. It's just more notes about how Mordecai knows that deliverance from God will happen, and that if Esther would fail, he's very confident in God's abilities, that the providence of God will be there to carry him through. So if someone wants to read verses 15 through 17 for me.
Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
Thank you. So, as we can see here, she is now coming back and giving a command to Mordecai, just how Mordecai gave a command to Esther. So she is saying to go gather all the Jews who are present in Susa and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So she has decided now that she is going to go to the king's court. She is going to present herself, and as she clearly puts it, if I perish, I perish. So she is willing to accept the fact that if the king doesn't want her to be there, that she will die, because she knows that she will die regardless in a couple of months when the pogrom is supposed to take place. So she's willing to go again from that passive role to that active role, and try to make something happen as much as she can, listening to her father in that standpoint. Again, she is outlining or telling them to fast for the 3 days, both day and night. It was very common for them to fast for just a day back in that culture, but she's essentially doing this and to prepare herself to go. So she's embracing the her Jewish roots and her faith of going through the fasting to prepare herself to do this, using or through God. I do believe I have a note in here. Well, then, always religion is a community practice. So Esther wanted Mordecai and all the Jews to know that she and all her maids would fast along with the community. The danger was not past, so she ended her bill saying that if I perish, I perish. Tradition is important for any religious people, but tradition implies that a community, and Esther and Jews, they stood together, and their common traditions held them together, as noted in Thessalonians 2:15, and they go through their fasting period. So she's preparing herself. Mordecai went his way and did according to Esther commanded. So once again, we're seeing them put on their sackcloth and their ashes and going through to prepare to go to the king, which will outline once we get into chapter 5, as she's going to go to King Xerxes and kind of set up her banquets and things like that. Does anyone have any more comments, questions, or discussions that they want to present? Yes, ma'am.
When they're fasting, they're petitioning God for
Yes.
the assistance of things to go correctly. So sometimes I think we should maybe find ourselves doing that. We don't do that, or a lot of people don't do it. I don't do it, but I find that maybe, especially with the world and the way it is right now, maybe we should take the time for ourselves to do that, petition God help us in our country to be more, bold and things to be better and things like that. And, communications and things and how people get together and, how we can love one another instead of continuously having all these divisions that's going on.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that's actually the note that I was trying to find, is that she is making that petition to God, and they do that through that fasting phase. And Jesus never commanded us to fast to do anything for that petition to God. Now it's all going through prayer. I can't remember pulling this reference out of my brain exactly where it says, but you're supposed to remove yourself and pray. Go to the inner part of your household and be in private so you can focus solely on your prayers. Essentially what they're doing. They're going through that 3-day fast through day and night so they can petition to God, just as we would pray today in that manner. So thank you for that. Does anyone else have anything to add on or additional comments? Awesome. It's a little early, but we'll wrap it up here. What we'll be getting into next week, Lord willing, is we'll see that Esther is actually going to come to the king's court. Xerxes will receive her. And this will kind of outline where we're going through with the further thing where she wants to make a banquet, and the king definitely agrees to throw a banquet to honor Haman. And then this will eventually turn and flip over, and then we'll go with essentially the start of ending this program from happening, which, as we all know, eventually does happen. So awesome. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.